I have unfortunately experienced the loss of a loved one before in my life, and when someone passes away and you you have to deal with a lot of stuff, it's a terrible, terrible thing. It is a horrible thing, and if you are experiencing that, or if you have experienced that, my compassion and fullness goes out to you. It is egregious to me that a person who is experiencing grief and pain and agony also has to deal with a ton of paperwork, a ton of finances, a ton of reporting. Having time limits on when you have to get these things done while having to deal with grief is ridiculous to me. It's not just sucky that almost all workplaces in the United States of America don't have very long for grieving for you to take off. Your takeoff time for the loss of a loved one from your hours of work, it's marginal. And your grief is not gone quickly. And so it can be extremely horrible. On top of that, you've got all the other stuff that you have to deal with, even besides trying to get back to work. And that financial stuff, I'm gonna try to talk about some of it and list it out just in case someone, maybe you're not even in the situation yet, but you know you're eventually going to be. Eventually someone you love or care about is going to pass. It could be your parent, it could be a partner, it could be a sibling, you know, it happens. And you gotta deal with some stuff. The first thing I want to make really, really clear is what happens after they pass away depends on what they did before they passed away. If they set up nothing at all, it goes to court if it's over $30,000 in most states. If their vehicle is worth more than $30K, or if the random material possessions they had were worth more than $30K, it goes to court, and it can take a year or two. And that's minimum sides. If there's no will, there's no trust, anyone who could possibly be a beneficiary can come to the judge and argue their case and try to get stuff. You could have been their, person they lived with in a domestic partnership or something for over a decade. If they didn't write anything down before they died, anyone can come and claim before the judge. You have to get lawyers involved. It can be extremely expensive. The average, even for people who have written a living will, the average loss on assets when it transfers to beneficiaries is 20%. So say they had a $100,000, 20% of that is automatically just gone. Beneficiaries are going to get less, and that's if the person had no debt. If someone has nothing written down at all, say they got kids, what's happening for those poor kids? At the minimum, have some sort of something written down. If you cannot afford to go to a lawyer and get a living will, either write something down and take it to a notary, or else you have to have 2 witnesses sign it. In most states, the written down thing, technically you can just write something down, but it's very contestable in court. Most judges will go with what's written down if there was witness signatures, even if it wasn't actually established with a lawyer and made into a living will. Most judges will still respect that, but they're not required to. So if someone else comes and makes a claim and the judge believes them, it still could get not respected. A living will gets you an assurance that the judge is probably going to go with what you want, because you have someone defending what you want by having the living will. The living will costs a few $100, so that sucks if you can't afford it. But at least there's something there, and your beneficiaries actually get something, and it's pretty certain. But it still goes to probate. Probate is terrible. It still goes to probate, and if anyone wants to contest it, they still can, and it still means lawyers, and it still means a year or two in courts. If someone passes away, like people talk a lot about the great wealth transfer, that money doesn't instantaneously, 2 days after they die, get transferred down to the beneficiary. It takes sometimes years and years for that money to actually come down to the beneficiaries. What is the best thing to set up before passing away is if the person that you lost set up a living trust. If they set up a trust, first thing it does is means no probate. No going to court, no dealing with lawyers, no dealing with judges, no dealing with people making contest. Almost all living wills are set up where if someone makes a contestment to what the living trust says, they get nothing. Instead of being a beneficiary with such and such amount, they just don't get anything instead. So it is a way for you to set up before you die how you want your money to go, what you want it to be spent on, how you want your material possessions to be divvied out, what you want done with everything. It also includes a prime directive. A living trust means that the trustee that you set up can then help if, say, you got in a horrible car wreck and you ended up in a coma, or you lost your cognitive functions in your mind, say you got Alzheimer's when you got older. There is stuff that you can set up to take care of yourself even if you haven't actually passed away. A couple $1,000s for a living trust is expensive, it seems like. But in the long run, a living trust is the way to avoid automatically losing 20% of everything that's going to the beneficiaries. And it's a way for you to have a real say in what happens without a judge or without other people being involved in what's going to be done. The living trust is a contract that, yeah, what you say goes. This is exactly what will happen. Maybe you feel like you want to put in there some really specific stuff. My kid right now is 8 years old. If I die before my kid is 18, my kid doesn't get any money raw. But any money necessary for my kid's education, including paying for textbooks, laptops, whatever, that goes to the kid, and the objects will get purchased by the trustee. Once my kid is 25, then they can start getting money raw, this much per month. However you want to look at it, you can really make things specific. So the very first thing is, what did they do before they died? In the case of the person who passed away, for us, they had less than 30K in assets, and they didn't really do anything. They basically told a family member what they wanted, and the family member did what they thought would be best. We had taken care of the person for like 12 years because they were dying very, very slowly from having smoked. I am very not okay with cigarettes because of watching them die as I was growing up, a kid and a teenager, and helping take care of them. And, you know, I probably have some PTSD, in all honesty, from the horrificness of how they died. So I will never be a smoker. But that's a side point. What's really the point is essentially the adult involved after this person passed away decided that of what was left over after they passed, they were going to pay themselves for all of that stuff. And almost all of the medical assets, such as the medical bed, the big giant oxygen machines, all that stuff, the walkers, the wheelchairs, all of that all got sold and liquidated, and they used that all to pay themselves. And then anything that they felt they deserved for being paid for all their years of effort, they did. And then the siblings, who were the children of the person who passed away, they gave them $1,000 each and said, that's all you get. And then the grandchildren and the siblings, they gave a couple of little small ittle-piddle items. So one person basically took almost everything. And the next thing I want to say is it's really important to think about what to do before you pass away. You can't control what they did before they passed away, but it's so important because I have seen what happens when you mix raw pain from grief with raw fear of facing mortality with there's some sort of resource that can help me avoid. It makes the worst come out in people. People who you thought were like friendly or nice or giving or kind or generous, when someone passes away and there is money or assets involved with their pain and their grief, they turn into some sort of weird vulture person that they never acted like before. And it can like destroy families. It can cause such big rifts that it creates feuds. And it's so important to do something. If you can't afford a trust, make a will. If you can't afford to pay hundreds of dollars for a living will, at least write something down and get some witnesses. Because having something of any kind helps to reduce how much everyone can act like animals after someone dies. All of that pain makes everyone's patience thresholds way low, and all of that suffering makes everyone on edge and defensive. And people really, really can get very greedy and aggressive with each other after someone passes. So you can't do anything about the person who's passed away already. They already passed. But you yourself can set up something of some kind to make it less bad for the next people. For your own beneficiaries. And try to make sure that the people that you want to receive stuff get stuff. And it can be hard to do this because you have to, again, face your own mortality. But we all die. It's part of life. And it is something that needs to be paid attention to. And it is an uncomfortable thing. But you can take comfort in knowing that the things that you want to happen are more likely to happen. That just by doing this uncomfortable thing, you have raised the odds. For the person who's passed, you need to really financially accept that there's certain amounts of money that are just going to disappear. Part of it I already talked about, the 20% loss just from probate, just from going to court, dealing with lawyers, dealing with the judge, dealing with people making contestments. That's just going to happen. On top of that, you need to accept that pretty much minimum, the lowest cost, including like hidden fees and stuff that you're going to be spending to take care of someone's body, their actual physical body that's left over after they have passed away, is probably going to be around $4,000 to $6,000 depending on your state. The bare minimum that you can spend on it. You might say, oh, well, in my state it's only like, $400 for cremating. That's not all. You gotta pay for the body to be moved. You've gotta pay the hospital or whatever morgue or whatever for storing the body. You have to pay for any kind of funeral or wake or costs of that nature. You have to deal with a lot of hidden fees for stuff. If they, say clean up the body, they're gonna charge you. If they put makeup on the body or they dress the body, that costs money. If they do an autopsy, you might think, oh, well, they did me a favor. They donated their body to science beforehand. Donating the body to science, you have to actually pay to do that. It's not just like automatically the hospital just sends it over and you didn't pay anything. It's frustrating. Say they were an organ donor. Well, there's still going to be leftovers, and you're going to have to pay for that. It's something to be aware of. The costs involved with the physical leftover body, that's horrible. You're grieving. You're in pain. You don't want to have to pay and deal and write out stuff, and yet you have to. If you have someone and they had life insurance, you have to report and you have to deal with all that paperwork. And it does not come quickly. It is not an instantaneous thing. So the life insurance, it can take a little bit for it to start coming in. If your loved one had, say, retirement accounts and stuff like that. You have to actually report that. When you finally get a death certificate, you need to get 6 copies. 6. If you have someone who was old enough to get Social Security. You can get 5 if it's lower than that. But if they were old enough to get Social Security, or if they were disabled and getting Social Security, you need 6 copies of that death certificate. You're going to have to report to the bank so that all of the banking stuff can switch over. And again, all of that money in the bank and everything else, it's all frozen when they die. And a judge has to say, yep, the will says you get the money. Okay, it's not instantaneous. If there's a trust in place, you can literally take the death certificate and a copy of a piece of paper from the trust to the bank. They'll switch it over. But that's only for a living trust. If there's probate, which is anything but the living trust, you can't do that. You've got to report to the different credit bureaus. They don't just say, oh, look, the bank says this person's dead. Okay, you have to actually tell them, hey, this person's dead. There is a time limit on when you can do stuff. You have, I believe it's 30 days to report to the government anything. So if they were getting Social Security, for instance, you got 30 days to tell the government this person has passed away. You have to, if they were getting food stamps, if they were getting child care benefits, or if they were on Medicare or Medicaid, you have to report that this person has passed away. Financially, you've got to deal with any fees for making copies of stuff if you don't have a printer. If you need to, there are some places that will help you for free, but you've got to actually call and get in a waiting list and make an appointment. So it still is effort. And again, you have very little energy. You are grieving, so this is horrible. There are certain things that take advantage of that. And I want to go ahead and let you know what your rights are for some of those things. One of the things is a timeshare. If the person passed away and you inherit a timeshare, timeshares are horrible money sinks. They are miserable. They are the worst to get saddled with. You have 6 months in most states to get rid of that timeshare, or else you are stuck with it and you are bound to that contract. And timeshare contracts are extremely difficult to get out of. In a couple of states, it's 3 months. So make sure you get out of the timeshare. If you inherit a timeshare, get out of it. And you're distressed, you don't want to deal with that, and they're gonna be resistant to it. But death is the only way that you can for sure get out of the contract, despite the fact that they'll complain about it. They will try to keep you in it. Don't listen to them. The timeshare is horrible. If you don't get out of the timeshare fast enough, you're stuck with it. And it might literally be something that you have to be stuck with for the rest of your life. Contracts for timeshares are extremely difficult to get out of. Another thing is, if that person passed away with debt and any of the debt had your name tied to it, you are now also probably in most states liable for the debt. But if that person passed away and the debt was only on their name, the creditors, the debt collectors, whatever, they take from the leftover assets to pay the debts. They cannot take from you. Any money you had, any money that was your saving, any money that was under only your name, or any assets that were only under your name, even though you are the beneficiary and you are getting something out of the estate, they can't come hound you. Some collectors sometimes call and say you're responsible, but you're not. If they took the entire estate, maybe they passed away and they only had like, you know, $15,000 worth of stuff, but they owed $100,000 in debt, that debt goes unpaid. That's not your responsibility to pay, and if someone tries to convince you it is, you legally have rights. Okay? It sucks that they would do that while you are grieving. It sucks that they would call you or try to insist that you need to provide something while you are grieving. You are in pain. But it's also, that's their job. They're just trying to get as much money out of it as they can. Know your rights, okay? You don't have to pay any debts that did not have your name tied to it that the other person had in most states. It will come out of their assets though. And that can suck. That can mean that you get left with nothing. They might have written out a will, they want you to be the beneficiary, turns out they had more debt than the worth of the things that they owned and the money that they had. You get nothing. That sucks. That's terrible. And if you want to try to contest that in court, you have to contest it in court with your own lawyers, while this collectors or the creditors or whoever it is, a bank even, has a lawyer who's probably a lot more expensive than your lawyer, and therefore probably more qualified. It can be very difficult. It can be extremely emotionally damaging, and that's horrible. That sucks. It really, really sucks. If the person passed away and they say had property, the property goes to all the beneficiaries, get a share of the property, unless specifically stated otherwise. That's horrible. You might have paid all toward the mortgage for years and years and years, and your parent, you were taking care of them for years and years in the house, and it was your parents' house. The mortgage isn't quite paid off yet, but you've paid most of it. They die, suddenly all your siblings have just as much right to the house as you, even though they weren't there. And you have to go and actually either get them to physically sign off on paperwork saying that they don't want that share of the house and that they relinquish it to you, or else deal with it in court. If the money, if the assets are in a living trust, in most states, that's not true. Whatever the beneficiary is supposed to get from the living trust, that's what they get. Also, the creditors, the debt collectors, stuff like that, they can't just take the money out of the living trust. The living trust also can be made the beneficiary of retirement accounts. So say you've got someone and they passed away and they had a Roth IRA. The Roth IRA's been growing over the years, and then they pass away before they can claim any of the money or any of the compounded interest that they got on that money, and it grew, and it became a bigger lump of money. The trust gets that money. Because the trust gets that money, none of the debt collectors can touch it. And the beneficiaries then have access to a certain amount of it a year. The living trust, again, it costs more to set up, but it's very helpful in the long run. Financially, you're going to have to deal with a lot of really ridiculous bullcrap. There's inheritance taxes up to a certain point. I believe if you keep it under $19,000, then you can inherit the money and it's okay, and it doesn't have to be, stamped down on and stuff. And up to that point, I believe taxes are way lower, inheritance taxes. Once you get over that, though, inheritance taxes jumps up significantly in most places. Also, in most states, you can receive assets in the way of, like, say, a land trust or property or like a business, and it can be worth up to like 12.6 mil. And then after that, it's taxed at like 40%. So it's almost half the value after that. But up to that, it's not like raw money, and instead it's again, a property or something like that. Then it can be worth up to a certain point before it gets hit with the really heavy taxes. So when you're inheriting something as a beneficiary, be aware. When you say you inherit some money, be aware what the tax is in your state and set that aside, because next year that tax is going to be hitting you. When you can't touch that money. You need to save that money because that's taxes next year when it gets to tax season. You need to be aware of that. You need to understand that. One thing that can help, if say you yourself, you're getting ready to set up stuff for when you're passing away, you are allowed to give up to a certain amount per state in gifts to people before it's taxed. Look up what that amount is for your state, and instead of it all being a big giant lump when you die, start giving them gifts ahead of time. Another thing that you can really do to help things is liquidate some of your stuff ahead of time, because you're allowed to liquidate a certain amount of your stuff each year without it being taxed. Oh, you already owned, you know, this beautiful bedroom set and you sell it for $300. Congratulations, it's not taxed, and the money then can be split up between your beneficiaries. They don't have to deal with as much physical, material stuff to be sorted through after you pass away while they're grieving. Who wants to be sobbing and dealing with grief while also digging through drawers and looking through a bunch of stuff? It's exhausting. It's extremely exhausting. So be aware, if the person who passed away, you're dealing with their stuff, it's too late. But you can learn from this, and for your stuff, when you give to your beneficiaries, you can make it less hard for them. There's things that you can do to help with the finances, and there's things that you can do to help with the stress. Because it's sad and it is distressful. It is not easy at all. And again, it is so unfair that all this stuff has to be dealt with while you're trying to recover from the extreme loss of losing someone you cared about. You have been emotionally damaged, mentally scarred, and you still have to do all this crap. It's hard. The other thing about a living trust is they can set up a trustee, and the trustee doesn't have to be someone who's going to be as emotionally taking a blow. They could set up a trustee to be, say, you know, their best friend or their sibling, so that their spouse doesn't have to do it, because they know their spouse is just going to be distraught. But they trust their sibling to take care of their spouse, and if the trustee isn't doing their job, next in line trustee gets the job instead. You can make it less bad for the people who are dealing with stuff after you've passed away, because they're not just dealing with the paperwork, they're not just dealing with the money, they're not just dealing with the reporting to these different places, to all this different stuff. They're dealing with emotional and mental anguish and physical exhaustion. Another thing that you can do is, when someone has passed away, you can get out of subscriptions. If it is a cell phone company or an internet company, something like that, say you have a subscription to the service or you have a contract or whatever, one of the only ways to get out of that kind of stuff is if the person has passed away. And if you can show proof that yes, this person has passed away, then you can get that shut off. It's hard to get it shut off unless someone has actually died. So even if, say, they're in the hospital, if they've already got something going and it's set in like a contract or something, they're still going to expect that to keep happening. There are some rental agreements that you can get out of if someone has died, but a lot of rental agreements anymore come with a clause that even upon death, the rent is due. So that sucks. Something to be aware of. But there are some places that haven't switched to that kind of contract yet. The biggest things that you need to understand is that when someone passes away, the beneficiaries don't automatically get stuff. If there's a title on something or a deed for something, or it's worth more than, again, in most states, $30,000, you can't just go to the DMV and say, hey, here's my vehicle, my spouse died. It has to go to the court unless it's in a living trust. It's just the sad truth. But it's more likely that the court proceedings will be faster and more in your favor if there's a living will, or at least some sort of written will. If there's nothing, the court is required legally to notify anyone who could be a beneficiary. You're not guaranteed anything. Finances, when there's death, is just hard. And if you are going through this, if you are looking up this video because someone you love just died and you need to know all this information, I am so sorry. It's not fair. You shouldn't have to deal with this much hardship. It's hard enough. I'm so sorry. Hopefully, some of the people who look this up are looking it up because they're trying to think ahead for their own passing away. And I hope it helps.